often that's what linguistics does. And that's what linguistics is about. Now, there's nothing wrong with that if you see it as a descriptive approach to language systems. I sound like Peter Matthews here. General linguistics describes language systems. General linguistics has important applications. But what it can't do, I submit, is help us understand these big questions about people, about societies, about minds, and about the ecology. To do that, we have to start somewhere else. We have to ask what people do with language, and perhaps more importantly, what language does with us. And he used to walk up to the stage and get people to write down what he had done as he walked to the stage and read it out, and how everyone saw something a little bit different. The word is best known from Maturana, who says that people happen in language, and stresses that in order to say something, one has to be able to observe. And in order for anything to be said, there has to be the observer, and the observer emerges from language. There are other early sources. I have recently heard that Hatch Ross developed this term in his discussions of poetry in the 1970s. Becker traces it back to Heidegger and to Ricoeur as well. I think the Heidegger influence is perhaps more important here, because Heidegger stresses that language speaks through us, and actually goes back to other traditions, which I won't go into, because I don't want to get distracted. Well, Wittgenstein wouldn't use a word like languaging, because Wittgenstein is interested in what you do once you've got the agreements and judgments, rather than how you get to the agreements and judgments. And I want very much to place the weight on the reaching the agreements and judgment, rather than the games you play with the definitions. So I would put Wittgenstein in a slightly different position there. And when I first read Wittgenstein, I was a bit annoyed he used the word sentence all the time, but then I realized he is writing about sentences. And when we're talking about languaging, or when we're doing sociolinguistics, we're not primarily interested in sentences and those kinds of agreements and definition, which is so important to the language games of which he's concerned.
That clears up a lot.
So, if you want to give a nice academic definition, you can define languaging as referring to activities involving language. Nigel Love offers a set here. I feel that thinking ought to be in that set. If thinking is the kind of thing that you do when you're sitting on your own, I think that's also an activity in which wordings play a part. But Nigel doesn't put it in there. And so it subsumes a set of common verbs. And clearly the term is useless to designating a field of study. It's far too broad. You can't study singing and thinking in exactly the same way. But it does pick out an important aspect of collective life. And it picks out an aspect of collective life, that phrase activity in which wordings play a part. One where people do things together, or build on doing things together to do things on their own, such that they can do things together with other people. And of course, this is the standard interdisciplinary move away from a focus on language as an object, away from a focus on language as something to explain, to ask what it is that we can do with language in terms of explaining what concerns us. What can what we know of language tell us about people? What can what we know of language tell us about the difference between humans and other species? What can it tell us about politics? Why is it important for questions of values? And that's the kind of direction that I'm going in. So obviously it's irreducible to utterances because it's social activity. Utterances may be regarded as a constituent part of it, but it is activity. It's full-bodied activity by living human beings. It's situated, and you can transcribe aspects of it. But of course, they're only aspects. I mean, the awful thing about a big room like this is the way the sound reverberates. And so we're all aware, being a few people in a room, perhaps more me than the rest of you, but it's affecting what is going on in interesting kinds of ways. It's part of the specious present, which I brought to your focus of attention for a moment. I'm revoicing things. Paul's question about Wittgenstein got me to revoice bits of Wittgenstein at you, which I could have gone on about in more detail. It's about affect. It's about imagining. None of you have heard this talk before. You have to guess at what I'm saying to a very considerable extent. So you can't focus on languaging as an object of study, but you can break that down and say, well, in humans today, if we want to understand all this heterogeneous complexity, we could start with where children begin to find their way into language, with talk, with face-to-face languaging. And just to give you a bit of flavour, I'm going to remind you a little bit about talk. And this is an old piece of data which I collected for my PhD. It's a mother and a daughter. The mother is in black and the daughter is in blue. This is happening in Italy. They're preparing food which includes salamino. And if you don't know what salamino is, go to Italy someday and try it. There's three utterances there with bold on them. That represents overlap or joint speech. I think joint speech is seriously underrated in the study of language. It's something which occurs in all societies and seems to carry great importance to us, but it tends to get dismissed as overlap and as not turn-taking in a moralistic kind of way. I can't render that for you because I can only do one voice at a time. But it sounds something roughly like this. They are eating, so the grammar is wrong at the beginning. We hear this, but we think it's because they're chewing on the salamino. So it comes across as, tanto è buono, ti faccio un altro salamino per Francesco? Fallo, perché è veramente buono. Non è che è buono, sono sicuro che gli piace. Tanto che è buono e me lo mangiamo. Sì, perché questo in genere non mi piace, ma questo è veramente buono. That's languaging. That's what it sounds like. And that sounding like is important. And it gets lost if we focus on phonology and lexis and syntax with a bit of pragmatics added. So I hope you've got a sense of what I'm interested in when I look at languaging and specifically talk. So the question, are we just talking about semiosis? I'm not giving you a full answer to this. It's meant to be partly a provocation in response to Paul's provocations, and a partial answer. The parallel I have already suggested is that semiosis brings forth worlds, like the coral reef, or like art. You don't have to look into nature if you don't want to, but art comes out of nature. And language brings forth perspectives. And each of us has our own perspective on all kinds of things, which is brought forth by our language as important to how we do being ourselves, because we tend to care about those perspectives. And if we take a strong Persian view, including his metaphysics, and we say that living and semiosis are basically the same thing, if semiosis is the foundation of the living, and if the living is semiosis, then we are bound to say that languaging is just another description of semiosis, because I do my languaging as a living thing with other living things. If we are agnostic about that claim, we proceed with the argument as follows. Well, first of all, for me, this is quite clearly semiotic, what is represented both by the photograph and by what the photograph represents. So there's no wordings playing a part either in the camera that took that picture or in the fish and the corals. So semiosis is clearly the wider and, if you like, more profound concept. Because in languaging, what I'm calling physical wordings And I want to stress the physical, not because everything is physical, but because the actual physics of speech and the physics of hearing play a part in languaging. One is clearly taking a subset of that, or a subcategory of that much larger kind. And clearly, languaging is also amenable to semiotic description. I gave and showed a transcript and used the transcript to remind myself of something which I work on from a kind of recollection of having heard that piece of tape hundreds of times. So it's more than the transcript, but of course the transcript has a role in my rendering of it, and the transcript is a symbolization of the speech. It is a semiotic description of what those two people said on a particular occasion. But my concern is not with the transcript. My concern is with what people do on particular occasions. And while we can take the strong Peircean view and regard semiosis as synonymous with life, we can take weaker views and say it names a field of study, and that's it. Or that it's some kind of heuristic, or that it's a field of study and a heuristic. And I don't think that is in any way controversial, and I can certainly live with that. So the question, and I'm repeating myself here, is do we really want to commit ourselves to the strong view that languaging is ultimately a matter of relating firstness, secondness, and thirdness? Or if you prefer, for those who are not familiar with Peirce, icons, indices, and symbols. And of course, the theory is much more complicated than this. This is just a simple version. So does languaging then reduce to semiotic description? If it did, it would reduce, and I'm not sure reduce is the right verb there. I nearly took it out and then I left it in. I perhaps should have said, is it tantamount to a form of semiotic description? But I don't want to have a big discussion about that verb. Is languaging about feeling, regularity, and the symbolic? And is it always about feeling, regularity, and the symbolic? Or if you prefer again, icons, regularities being indexes of various kinds, and the symbolic being symbols. FRS is how I want to try to remember it. Tanto è buono, ti faccio un altro salamino per Francesco? Fallo perché è veramente buono, né che buono, né che buono, né che buono, né che buono. Okay, is there feeling there? Né che buono. I see one head nodding definitely. Anyone salivating apart from me? Yeah? Interesting if we are. You probably have to know Salamino in Italy to get into that side.
Yeah, speak Italian.
Yeah. So, feeling definitely. Regularity. Ne che buono. Pretty clearly, lots of regularity there. Interestingly, I can vary it in all kinds of ways. I can say ne che buono. Ne che buono. There are clearly patterns coming into play there. Is it symbolic? Ne che buono. Not what you can see, what you hear. Paul?
Yes.
No. So that's our discussion. Paul says yes, I say no. Let's see if we can get there. I'm so glad you said that. So, I don't think it's symbolic. I think the shared feeling in the actual talk comes from the taste of the Salamino. I think the Salamino is at the core of what is going on here. And the regularities are, if you like, celebrating the feeling and the taste of the Salamino. The burst, ne che buono, is not really symbolic because the wordings, the meaning in that linguistic sense is playing almost no role at all. And so, if you buy my argument, and you don't have to because this is the controversial, provocative part, if you buy my argument, activity where wordings play a part need not be heard in terms of what can be described as symbols. It can just be something with which we engage feelingfully by bringing forth regularities. And that basic sharing is necessary to face-to-face languaging, but without writing systems, there is no need to add a symbolic dimension at all, although rudimentary symbols undoubtedly would emerge in many kinds of languaging activity. Languaging starts to do some work here as well, because what I want to do is just briefly show you some other languaging activity involving a little chap who's 9 months old. It's only 45 seconds of video. It's amazing I still use this data. I originally collected it because it was so useful for teaching about child development, and I was working as a developmental psychologist. And it's just a classic of what happens at 9 months. He's 9 months old, and famously at 9 months old, babies and their mothers learn to relate about things. It's called triadic behavior, and it's given great importance in development. I just want you to look at it. It's South African data. It's a rather scrappy old video. I apologize for the quality of it. But the question is, what do you see? And he goes and gets it. And I want you to look at it one more time. Same question, just look at it. What have I done wrong? Just wonderful. We can watch it more. He's so cute. What do you see?
They both fix their gaze on the thing that's moved forward.
Pardon?
They both fix their gaze on the thing that's moved and
Yeah.
An interaction means I'm going to get that for you somehow. Or they're sharing a perception of that. They're establishing that we're both looking at that thing.
Yeah, I mean, they're in the jargon, they're jointly attending to an object which the mother is enabling her son to attend to, or something like that. What else do you see? That's a very psychological answer, that is.
Repetition.
Repetition, yes. Repetition is cool. Right? Repetition is really important in languaging, and also in learning to be a person, and being a person. What else do you see? I mean, there's no right answer to this. I'm not testing you. We're not doing an exam.
The boy seems very happy.
Yeah.
When we've established together that thing, it starts to move towards it.
And
Big
I mean,
smile.
we've often speculated if this is a kind of first time, or if she's just enjoying it because she's on camera. But she's so chuffed that he can get it, and he does get it. So that it's really a moment of shared usness, which plays out. And if he weren't 9 months old, it wouldn't be nearly so exciting. But this is something new, which they can thus begin to do. So Luke, which is what his name is, gets what his mother wants. It's languaging in the sense of activity in which wordings play a part, and it's highly successful communication, if you will. I would cash that out as it says on the slide, but that's not really important. It's based on feeling and regularity, and above all, repetition of various kinds. Do you want to fetch that? Fetch that. Fetch it. Do you want to fetch that? Go fetch it. I knew I got it wrong. Do you want to fetch that? Go fetch it. Fetch it. And a lot depends, as you rightly say, on the gaze at the object, the establishment of joint attention, but not just that. There's the mother's position, which she maintains all the way through, and then there's an exchange of gaze between the mother and the baby, all of which contributes to the languaging that we see and hear in that particular excerpt. And my case is, of course, that the mother uses wordings, but that Luke doesn't. Luke probably doesn't even have an inkling that there's anything that could be transcribed there, although it is quite likely he picks up on the repetition, and that three-part repetition is typical of mother-infant interaction.
Gestures are playing a part, aren't they? Gestures.
The gestures are absolutely fundamental to this, especially the way the mother puts her. We think that she probably is going to get it, and then she kind of thinks, hey, the camera's on, let's see if I can get him to do it. And she then stays in that position. We didn't ask her about it at the time. So here you have languaging behavior, I submit, which is working perfectly well, where for Luke at least, it can't be symbolic. But the symbols are nonetheless working through Luke, and that's the interesting part. So most of you would have heard, do you want to fetch that? But of course what she actually says is more like, do you want to fetch that? We get rid of all that in our hearing, especially if it's a second language for us. We're clearly not just orienting to the physical signal. And Luke, as my friend at the back says, is orienting to the physical signal as the mother's body and her gesture. He's acting as a nascent self, someone who's able to do things that his mother wants. And this is the beginning of that particular stage. But of course, what he can't yet do is the revoicing. He can't say fetch. We don't know if this is a routine which has taken place many a time. We like to think it's perhaps a first time. But it is, of course, often the case that from such a situation, a child will learn to go fe, or something like that, which the mother will then hear as fetch, so that you can establish a fetching game where the child gets the mother to fetch things. And that's exactly the sort of thing that does appear at this age, and in the literature it's called role reversal imitation. So Luke is on the way towards being able to do things with what we think of as symbolic, but I wish to suggest is not in any way, and does not need in any way, to draw on the symbols which we can ascribe to the speech. He can't yet hear wordings, and he can't do that repeating, which is fundamental to the use of wordings. He's in a soundscape, he's in a familiar world. This is the kind of thing that happens. His mother isn't suddenly speaking South African when she normally speaks American English or something like that. He's very much at home in all senses. So what I want to suggest is that rather than needing to learn symbols, what Luke needs to do is something which we also do with our other senses, most strikingly with pictures. This is an example from James Gibson, the psychologist, and James Gibson talks in the text, in his famous difficult chapter on pictures, about a Rorschach image with, well, guess what?
Well, I see two figures facing each other.
Two garden gnomes.
Two garden gnomes, that's quite common, yes?
Splash of blood.
A blush of blood?
Yeah.
Yes.
A bean skin. Sliced from a brain.
Gibson says two dancing bears. And I picked this because I saw two dancing bears too, and I was really chuffed.
Oh, yes, you know.
But bleeding hearts, people quite often say. There are various ways in which you can see this image. And Gibson's point is very simple, that you can see invariants of the picture, like red ink, black ink, perhaps symmetry, and you can see invariants in the picture, such as blood or garden gnomes or bears, that our perception of pictures always involves what's of and what's in. And I want to argue that language is exactly the same. When we deal with languaging, we can deal with the languaging as something which is a physical, dynamical signal that affects us directly, and we can deal with it in relation to patterns that we hear in that flow of dynamics and so on. They're two different descriptions of the same phenomena. One which invites symbolic writing, if we happen to know the trick, and the other one which refutes symbolic writing. And that's what I call taking a language stance. And I would argue that this applies to all different perceptual modalities, not just to languaging and looking at pictures. So if we identify semiosis with the living, then of course languaging is just a description of semiosis. If we take a weaker view, then languaging is both less and more. It's less in the first place because it is human. Not exclusively human, because we have a cat which engages in activity in which wordings play a part with us. Many of you have dogs. We all know the stories about trained parrots and trained bonobos. So there's a fuzzy edge, but the role of wordings is characteristic of human modes of languaging. And of course, there's lots of debate about that. But what I think is more interesting, and why I think my debate with Paul, why I really wanted to come here to push this a bit forward, is because I think to focus on languaging also gives you more than you get from a focus on semiosis. And that's because instead of describing what happens in terms of feeling regularity in symbols, one brings into account how people change their intending, how they vary their attending. And attending, I think, is perhaps the most important function of language of all. It enables me to attend to things, it enables you to attend to things, it enables us to attend to things, and to attend to aspects of things. And that seems to me to be more basically either communication or cognition as standardly described. And as we orient to wordings, we build on so many skills. There are many ways of attending to wordings. I was sitting reviewing a paper earlier on. I'm happy to give a first reading on screen with very cursory attention. But before I finish reviewing, I will sit down with a printout and make detailed annotations on that paper. I'm reading the same thing, but the way in which I attend to the wordings is fundamentally different. And I argue that both kinds of attending are equally important to my particular way of undertaking the review process. I'm not orienting to the symbols, I'm orienting to the wordings. So that leaves me with this view, and I hope I'm not taking too long. What time did I actually start? I think I've taken longer than I should. That we can deflate the role of symbols here. And if I go back to my example, tanto è buono, ti faccio un altro di calamino per Francesco. Fallo perché è veramente buono, né che buono. What you got is, tanto è buono, ti faccio un altro di salamino per Francesco. Fallo perché è veramente buono, né che buono. You've got two different kinds of rhythm working, which I in my PhD called East Pole and West Pole. And one of the nice things about Italian is it uses both of those kinds of rhythm all the time. So what is at the core of this piece of conversation is this alternation of rhythmical types. You can't do that in English because English is so much a beat-based language. In my original discussion, I called it animated rapid talk, which is replete with rhythmical variation, giving rise to a sense of concord. And the parties are attuning to qualitative aspects of one another's behavior. Their enthusiasm is shared by how they weave their voices together. And that, for me, is the core of what is going on there. The taste of the Salamino is encouraging them to make this music by coordinating their rhythm in the way that they do and doing the simultaneous voicing that they do. And I could talk about that at great length, but that, I think, is much more important than its symbolic aspect or anything that could be said. And for me, the big step forward, and this is where I think we need so much help from sociolinguistics too, is that it opens up the field of study where symbols are so marginal. And instead of thinking about that field in terms of variation, variability, which is what sociolinguists have tended to do, we can look at it in terms of stabilities and how it is that we stabilize those stabilities in all kinds of genres and types and activities and so on and so forth. And this implies, I would argue, that we are not a symbolic species. We're simply a languaging species along the lines that Maturana would argue. And the trick lies in using shared feelings, regularities, making use of wordings as repeatables. And the fact that you can repeat aspects of speech is fundamental, not to us die and cause drought in the world. And that's what I thought I would do, and I'm sorry it took a little bit longer than it was meant to, and those are the things I went to. I'm happy to leave this if anyone wants it.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions? We have a little bit of time for questions. So do you have any? Can I start from a traditional linguistics
I think
perspective?
that's the best place to start.
You talk a lot about languaging, and I was thinking, what's the difference between languaging and discourse in a Cordian sense?
Well, the short answer to that is that the physical aspects of languaging are fundamental.
Okay.
And I don't know of an approach to discourse which brings into play the acoustic and bodily dynamics which are part of whatever it is that happens. I mean, I could go longer, but I mean, I think that is the fundamental difference. I mean, one of the slogans we use is dynamics first, symbols afterwards. And discourse tends to be the other way around. It tends to be symbols first and multimodality as a sort of decoration to that. And I think it's very important because, of course, it depends on the questions you're asking. But if the questions you're asking are about bringing things forth rather than simply reproducing, then one has to give weight to the dynamics, because it's through the dynamics and the disorder and the chaos that new things come forth. Whereas, of course, discourse does lend itself to repetition and endless repetition and can be described in statistical ways and so on. So I think there's a big discussion to be had there.
I think we disagree on even less than you believe that we do. The one thing I wanted to bring out is in this paper, the symbol is the enemy a little bit, isn't it? But in the Peircean sense, icons, indices, and symbols should each of them be written by syntactics, semantics, and pragmatics. And I wonder if you were thinking of the symbol as the enemy in this instance, more in terms of syntactics and semantics as stabilizing factors, because there's a strong pragmatic dimension to the symbol.
I mean, I see symbols. I mean, I'd rather talk about symbolizations than symbols, because I think symbolizations are more easily defined. I mean, and symbolizations I would define as arrangements of marks. Now, of course, I'm not saying that all symbols are symbolizations, but I'm saying that symbolizations are an important subset of symbols. And it seems to me that symbolizations may have precursors in other species and in humans before 6,000 years ago. But basically they've emerged in the last 6,000 years. And I think there's a very big danger in conflating symbolizations and things that we do with symbolizations with things which are in some sense symbolic. And those things which are in some sense symbolic are precisely things like Nekebwano. Because whatever Nekebwano is doing, it's not amenable to description as a symbolization. I haven't done a corpus analysis of that expression, let alone the intonational patterns associated with it. But I mean, that is precisely where the middle ground is so interesting. And of course I can understand why you say it's a symbol. And I'm sure you can understand why I say no, it isn't. But it's certainly not a symbolization. And I think a lot of the theorizing which goes on conflates those two categories.
Well, I said that it was a symbol in response to your question about it for reasons not dissimilar to, I'm thinking of other species. On the Blue Planet on Sunday, I don't know if people saw it, there were some dolphins playing with clamshells or something.
Yeah.
Incredible. But the thing that struck me is that they must have decided to get into some symbolic, broadly symbolic work.
I would dispute that too.
It was play, was it not for the feeling? I don't know.
What, in the jaw?
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm certain there was some of that too. Yeah. But the thing that struck me, and it struck me with Luke as well, you know, where I think there's some symbolic action going on there, is that it took place in space. And I mean, this isn't very explicit in semiotics, but you can find it here and there. You know, symbols are synonymous with mapping, you know, with cognitive mapping, and you know, and physical mapping as well. There's a relation to something that is in the world that you were trying in a quasi-arbitrary way to negotiate.
For me, that's a description which fits the symbol together with the symbolization. The way I would come at this, and I mean the dolphins, I also saw Blue Planet, is a good example of this. As we talk about, and I'm afraid it's a rather pompous sounding term, but we talk about the principle of cognitive separation. And what the dolphins exhibit is possession of this principle of cognitive separation, in that they're able to treat the shell as separate from themselves, to share attention to it, and to engage with what they're doing with the shell. I don't want to call that symbolic, and it certainly is not a symbolization. The longer story, which is a developmental story that I've kind of hinted at today, is one which makes the principle of cognitive separation, which is found in a number of species. And I mean, one of my colleagues reported having watched a jackdaw taking acorns and dropping them in front of cars to try to get them opened recently. I'm not sure if it's an accurate report, but if it is an accurate report, that's another example of this principle of cognitive separation. And it's applying to a very intelligent corvid. I think it's useful to start there rather than to start off by saying how it is that we should characterize a symbol. And then if you tell the developmental story, you can explore how the principle of cognitive separation comes into operation very early in development in humans. Around the 4th month it's clearly there, but it's not there at birth. And interestingly and very importantly, before that there's this stage of intense engagement with the other, which is very striking, and it occurs before the baby really begins to orient to things at all. And so it reinforces this view. I said to you beforehand that we are primarily social individuals who are caught up in this hypersocial network, and we're designed to be caught up in this hypersocial network within which we then individuate ourselves, who can do selving. And that puts the symbolizations late, but these semi-symbolic or quasi-symbolic modes of behavior are very early.
Yeah, I think we're really splitting hairs very thin now, you and I, because I first started to think about this a long time ago when I was finding out about psychoanalysis. And if psychoanalysis does anything right, it at least has identified the nascent
Symbolic relations.
nature of infant development.
No, but I mean, there's a lot of object relations theory at the back of some of the things I'm saying as well, and Winnicott in particular.
Indeed.
That's interesting too.
I think, but you know, I would still say that with that cognitive separation or cognitive differentiation, you were getting into a qualitatively different kind of sign use from other sign uses.
Well, typically it seems to just stop there. I mean, I think even with the dolphins, arguably, it doesn't go beyond using that principle in order to engage. I mean, of course, I don't know what they're doing anymore, that it does, but it seems to me that if one really starts to think about it in terms of infant development, one of the things which is so striking that I've never seen an account of, and I think are somehow bound up with this, is why it is that infants treat their own babbling as a kind of aesthetic resource, and they practice their babbling and improve their babbling. They must be able to hear it. I mean, in the developmental literature you talk about expectation narrowing or expectancy narrowing. They must have some kind of expectation for what it should sound like, and it doesn't sound like, and so they go on doing it, and they go on doing it, and they go on doing it. And that presupposes a principle of cognitive separation. And it relates very interestingly to, and it's Merlin Donald, I think, who claims that only humans can practice. But in fact, Irene Pepperberg's parrot, Alex, practiced as well. And there's a wonderful story about his practicing, in that for a long time he was the only parrot, and parrots are very hierarchical birds, and his trainer was the top parrot, and he was loved by this top parrot, and he loved the top parrot. But then she got another parrot, and this other parrot, it gets a bit long, but it is worth telling, I think. Parrots don't have don't have lips, so they can't say p and b sounds. So although they like playing with spools of film, Alex could not say spool and refused to try the word. This new interloper parrot came in and said something like spool, spool. And he got really rewarded for this because he'd learned something that Alex couldn't learn. Alex spent a year practicing on his own, doing private speech, and he got there and he did better than this other bird. It's the most extraordinary story, and it shows that parrots will practice. And he managed to find another way of producing this bilabial. And it's very, very interesting because, again, what you have is some way of evaluating your own vocalizations, which relate to what we would call a soundscape. That's Elmo Farina's term, which give rise to an aesthetic kind of criteria, which is, of course, fundamental to the rhythmicality of the speech that I was talking about too. So again, that's why I'm so hesitant to tar it with the notion of symbol.
It's a very fine distinction, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a fine distinction. It's really cool.
But it's a big
Differences
one.
make differences.
In evolutionary terms, it could be massive if you look at that issue over
Well,
millennia.
what's really interesting about cognitive separation is it does appear to have arisen independently in a bunch of very different lineages. You know, dolphins, parrots, humans, jackdaws.
I have a comment on you, see if you think this makes sense. I think a lot of linguists started off by being told to simplify things because life is so complicated, you have to look at some individual parts of it. Others, I think this is the reason that you and Paul are so similar, are saying rather than start by the little details and then try to add in the complexity to understand what's going on. So you start off looking at just the words and then you think, we better look at the prosody, oh, we better look at the body on the other. If you look at the entire complexity of what's going on in human behaviour, you've got more chance of accounting for it than starting from the details and going on. But does that sound reasonable to you? Does that
I think that is a part of the truth. And I mean, my PhD, as you just saw, was on prosody. And of course, prosody is interesting because, in a sense, prosody is the whole. But on the other hand, it's just the vocal dimension.
Well, I used to show a video, sometimes to students and sometimes in talks.
But
Sometimes to students and sometimes in talks to sort of show the complexity of what humans do. So it's a video in a classroom, and there's all sorts of things going on.
Yeah. But
and then you show a transcription of it by a linguist, there are only words or verbs, and you might get prosody. And to think about all the things we're missing.
But I mean, I hope I managed to make clear my point that I think there's plenty of room for descriptive linguistics, and certainly I think that applied linguistics needs the kinds of descriptions that traditional linguists have developed.
Yeah.
So it's not a kind of anti-linguistics talk in that way. It's really arguing that what is fundamental is a kind of eco-linguistics, And the descriptive linguistics is an add-on to that, as opposed to treating the descriptive linguistics as the core, with kind of macro-linguistics, socio and psycho and other things like that. So the social is foundational here. It's not marginal.
But my second suggestion would be to look at cases of people who started off in a narrow way and are now trying to get broader and see where they're going. And one example that was in my mind was meaning eliminativism. Have you heard of that?
Sorry?
Meaning eliminativism.
Okay.
So these are
yeah.
semanticists,
Yeah.
philosophers,
Yeah.
who are thinking we shouldn't think so much in terms of a word having a meaning,
Yeah.
but as kind of every experience gives us memory traces, and words have the same kind of thing going on. So they're moving, and it came in my head when you're talking about symbolization rather than symbols, because it seems to me that would
Well,
connect.
I have a PhD student who's trying to save semantics from coming from exactly that point of view. I'm very sceptical whether he'll manage, but that's what he wants to do. So, I mean, at the moment his explanandum is why is it that people believe in semantics? And I think where I would expect him to go is it's to say we can do things with writing and with symbolizations. And by learning to do things with symbolizations, we find ways of solving which are true and which we value and which mean that we are valued and so on and so forth. I mean, I kind of think that's the way it would go. But that's a very hot kind of issue amongst our group as well, because another of my PhD students just wants to dump semantics and argues that it's all pragmatic. And I don't really know where I stand, but I think they're fundamental questions. And I think one of the reasons I try to say loud and clear that languaging is just a useful superordinate term is because I don't want to suggest that it's actually terribly useful as something to study. And I have no problem with, I mean, any serious view of language has to account for meaning and linguistic meaning. And if you can't do that, then no one's going to listen. So I totally agree with you.
I think we're running out of time, so thank you very, very much for coming all the way from Cambridge. And I think we really enjoyed that.